Antes de venir como el justo juez, vengo como el Rey de misericordia. Antes de que llegue el día de la justicia, les será dado a los hombres este signo en el cielo. Se apagará toda luz en el cielo y habrá una gran oscuridad en toda la tierra. Entonces, en el cielo, aparecerá el signo de la cruz y de los orificios donde fueron clavadas las manos y los pies del Salvador. Saldrán grandes luces que durante algún tiempo iluminarán la tierra. Esto sucederá poco tiempo antes del último día. Mi llama de amor está quemando. Es tan grande que no la puedo mantener por más tiempo dentro de mí. Salta hacia ti con poder explosivo. Cuando se derrame, mi amor destruirá el odio satánico que contamina el mundo. El mayor número de almas serán liberadas. Nada como esto ha existido antes. Este es el milagro más grande que haré por todos.
So the virtue of patience, humility, envelops the soul with a profound calm amidst a storm around it. And this patience has to have trust, because as mentioned earlier, humility without trust is a false humility. Now, I wish to read this passage to you about trust in God's love and in His mercy. Once I read this to you, you will most likely think this passage comes from Faustina. It's so powerful and it's so connected with God's mercy as well. Jesus tells Luisa, "My daughter, the souls who will shine the most," and this comes from April 10th, 1912, volume 11. "My daughter, the souls who will shine the most, like bright gems in the crown of my mercy, are the souls who have the most trust. Because the more trust they have, the more they make room for the attribute of my mercy to pour into them any grace that they want." That's from Luisa. Sounds like Faustina. And the same teaching may also be found in volume 3 on February 4th, 1900, where Jesus tells Luisa, "Don't you know that lack of trust paralyzes the soul?" As well as on volume 5, July 19th, 1994, and in volume 4, October 14th, 1901. Trust is a very powerful thing in these end times. In fact, if you see this image over here, that's the divine mercy right there. We'll move the camera if I can a little bit, you can see it better. Right there, there's the image of the divine mercy. And the reason why Jesus had this image struck at the request of Faustina to an artist was because now we have to have trust. Jesus knew these times were upon us. So he had Faustina add at the bottom of the picture in Polish, "Jezu ufam Tobie." Jesus, I trust in you. And this is important. You know, divine mercy is connected with the divine will. Number one, because in these end times of the greatest evil, there is the greatest outpouring of mercy through God's vessel, Faustina and Luisa Piccarreta, these two vessels, and through our trust in Him. So going back to the divine will and it being a gift and not a virtue, we cannot receive this gift without trust. Why? Because if we use only human reason to understand what God is doing in us, we will never consent to it because we won't understand it. You see, this gift is so great that it surpasses human comprehension. Jesus tells this to Luisa many times, but it's not without reason and guided by faith. For example, let me give you an example. I'll ask you a few questions. Do you understand the hypostatic union of God becoming man? If you don't fully understand it, then why do you believe it? How do you believe it? Out of trust. Let me ask you another question. Do you understand transubstantiation? How God can become a bread and wine, literally. And if you don't fully understand it, why do you believe it? And how do you believe it? By trust. Faith is guided, inspired by reason. Reason inspired by faith. But you don't abandon reason, you use reason. You say, okay, well, I can use examples, analogies, like the sun, or like to explain the Trinity, or I could use an example like a mother and a daughter, or a child giving birth. How does the mother produce the daughter? How does the mother generate another human being? It happens, but we don't understand how it happens. God is behind that miracle of birth. So we can use that as an example and say, okay, I see a parallel, rational possibility here. And this is how we receive the gift of living in the divine will. How is it possible for God to, with his own creative power, render our finite acts in the human body in time and space timeless, whereby they are able to extend throughout the past, present, future times, impacting all creature of all time? We can't fully understand this, but with an act of trust, we adhere to it with faith, like we do transubstantiation, the hypostatic union, the mystery of the Trinity, and so forth. So the gift of living in the divine will is a mystery of our faith. Sometimes we may be caught up in the rationalization of this reality, of this mystery. And therefore this minimizes and diminishes our zeal, our enthusiasm, because we keep trying to understand it to the point where it can be distracting. We must use reason, yes, but always guided by faith. Now, how do we know that this is in fact a mystery of our faith? Well, because we have the church to say so, God's church. Christ said to St. Peter in Matthew chapter 16, on this rock I will build my church. He didn't say your church. Think of that. This is his church. He appointed representatives. And he tells Luisa that he does nothing without his priests. Nothing. So he sent Luisa to St. Hannibal. And every secretary of God, whether it's Faustina, Margaret Mary Alacoque, Catherine Emmerich, whoever, was always sent by God to a priest, always. Because this is his church, and he appointed this chain of command. God at the top, the papacy beneath God, the episcopate, the presbyterate, the diaconate, the consecrated, the lay. But even though you have this sort of spiritual totem pole that God put in place, this spiritual divine chain of command or hierarchy, it doesn't mean that the one at the bottom of the pole or the top of the pole are inferior or superior. We're all equal in God's love, in his nobility, and in his kingdom, where we are all called to occupy the highest hierarchy in heaven by virtue of the outpouring of this gift in these end times. Where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more, St. Paul said. And God has chosen to save his best wine for last. In these last days of human civilization before the kingdom of the divine will on earth, God is outpouring his best wine, which is this gratuitous gift given to us due to no exercise of our human virtue or our merit, due to no merit of ours, but due to his gratuity. Now, certainly we must dispose ourselves to receive this gift by exercising the virtues. But that's only disposing it. We don't obtain it. We simply dispose ourselves. And then we wait for God to say fiat. And he's the one who gives it to us. All the saints of the past were perfectly disposed to receive this gift. But one thing was missing, the gift itself. Just like John the Baptist and St. Joseph were perfectly disposed to receive these sacraments, but never received them. The only thing missing in their lives was Jesus saying fiat. So we are blessed to be chosen in these end times. We are the least meritorious of all human generations to receive this gift. We are the most rebellious of all generations that ever were. There is no doubt about it. But precisely because where sin abounds all the more, that God's mercy overcomes sin, and the darkness cannot contain the light. So God will win with this chain of light that he's forming through these links of his grace that are being established in our soul by him exercising his will through our will, his intellect through our intellect, and his memory through our memory. But let us not fear, but trust that God is in charge, even in these chaotic times, and everything that's happening is not by chance. It's by direct ordinance of the Most Holy Trinity. Now, God also emphasizes in Luisa's writings that linked to trust is obedience. Obedience, Jesus tells Luisa, stands out as the quintessential virtue. But we have to understand what obedience means. Whenever we hear the word obedience, many people's first reaction is, to who? Who am I going to obey? I'm not going to obey him. I'm not going to obey him. Who am I going to obey? Why do we have that reaction? Well, because we want to safeguard our soul and not expose it to danger. We don't want to obey the wrong individual. We want to invest our souls in someone in whom we can trust. So trust is linked to obedience. We have to trust the source of that obedience. So number one, it's God. We trust, we obey God in the internal forum of our conscience. That's the first exercise of obedience. Even before the church, it's to God. Then the second exercise of obedience to our parents when we're children. Then the third is to the church. And we have to inform our conscience, of course, of what church teaching is. Now, suppose someone tells you to do something, an authority, whether it's in the family or in the church or in the government, that tells you to do something that's wrong. Do you do it? You know, I was once asked, I was being prepared for vows in 1991 when I was in Italy. I entered the seminary in 88. So I've been ordained since 97, that's 24 years. But while I was being formed in 1991 for vows, we were talking about the three evangelical counsels of obedience, poverty, and chastity that we would have to pledge. So when we were discussing obedience, I asked one of the formators, what if the superior tells me to jump from a fifth-story roof? Should I obey him? And my superior said, what would you do? And I said, I would say, after you. And he said, good answer. So we have to use our reasoning, but guided by faith. If someone tells you to do something immoral, you don't do it. Why? Because all authority comes from God. And when that authority encroaches upon God's will, our conscience says, don't do it. I'll give you another example. Saint Joan of Arc, who was martyred by the church and declared as saved by the church, right? She was allowed an audience with the Pope when she was being tried at the court and being accused of being a witch before being burned at the stake. And by the grace of God and God's providence, she had a spiritual guide, a priest, who told her that it's your right to see the Pope and have an audience with the Pope, because they were basically trying her under the false pretexts with this kangaroo court and lying about the things she said, manipulating her words. But they denied her an audience with the Pope. They lied to her. So her spiritual guide informed her that they were wrong. And was she to simply say, okay, because you say I can't see the Pope, I will believe you. I will trust you. In this case, no, you don't obey. You should insist. I want an audience with the Pope. It's my right as a Christian, as a Catholic. Unfortunately, she had a priest who kept her abreast of her rights as a Catholic. So we have to inform our conscience through the aid of the church, of others, but also we have to obey first God through our conscience, then our parents when we're children, then the church. And when the angel Gabriel asked Mary to become the mother of God, what did she say? She did not say, sir, yes, sir. She said, how is this possible? She reasoned, she questioned, she asked how, and then the angel explained to her. And God was pleased by her questioning, her reasoning, because she did it with the light of faith in order for her intellect to accompany her fiat of the will. You see, if we don't know why we do something and just do it, that's blind obedience. The Church does not advocate blind obedience. It does not. This is found in two of the Church's magisterial teachings. Number one, Vita Consacrata, consecrated life. An apostolic exhortation by Saint Pope John Paul II. And another work called Gaudium et Spes, a Second Vatican Council document. Both of them state that obedience is not a heteronomy, where your will is blindly following commands without your intellect being engaged or understanding. That's a robot. But rather, obedience is the fruit of dialogue, with the superior having the last words after the dialogue. So if a superior or a bishop or even the Pope or someone says, do this, and you ask why or when or how, they're obliged to engage you in that dialogue and explain. This is how obedience is, just like with Mary and the angel. And God will be pleased by that. And we do this out of the good of our own spiritual betterment. We want to trust the source of these commands and trust, with both the intellect and the will. So the virtue of obedience, Jesus tells Luisa, is the quintessence of love. Obedience is the finest, the purest, the most perfect love extracted from the most painful sacrifice. This comes from Volume 1, and it's an undated entry. Because when Luisa wrote Volume 1 after her first few volumes, at the request of her spiritual director, spiritual counselor, she was writing it years after these events took place, so she could not recall all the dates. That's why you'll find in Volume 1 a lot of missing dates. But she remembered the events themselves. A glitch, all right. So Jesus tells Luisa, if the soul raises the slightest difficulty at what is commanded it, fearing that some vice may begin to reemerge within its heart, obedience wages war against the soul and affords it no peace until the soul prostrates itself at her feet and does with utmost silence whatever she wants. Obedience kills one's own will, and in torrents pours into it the divine, to such an extent that one can say that the obedient soul no longer lives by its own will, but by the divine will. And this virtue of obedience in the soul gives death to everything earthly and material, and restores its original perfection. So obedience has the power to divinize the soul, accompanied by trust in the source giving that command, and to transform its operation from the human mode, the human ways of thinking, acting, and praying, into the divine and eternal mode. So I now address the virtues of humility, of trust, of obedience, and I think these are important for these end times because there's a lot of confusion being circulated now, especially on social media. You have all groups attacking different sources. So you have a group attacking the Pope, a group attacking the government, a group attacking religious institutions, a group attacking the platforms that censor freedom of speech. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of attacks going in every direction, and we're caught in this crossfire. How do we discern true from false sources? This is important. And the first thing we have to do in these end times of confusion is inform our conscience of church doctrine. Why? Because doctrine never changes. Discipline changes. The church's discipline has changed throughout the centuries and will continue to change. That is our external form of worship. So if we go to one country, they have a different external form of worship than in another country. These are called, we may call them rites, different rites, or we may have different canon laws, like East and West. In the West, Western Code of Canon Law, the priests cannot be married. In the Eastern Code, they can. This is a discipline and it can change. But doctrine never changes. Doctrine is the unchanging revelation of Christ, preached by the apostles, known in Greek as kerygma ton apostolos, the first proclamation of the apostles of the Eastern mysteries, Christ resurrected. So inform ourselves of church doctrine, which never changes. Now, you have, even in the church, what you refer to popularly, and the media refers to as conservative and liberal. And this is an overgeneralization because certain people may be from a certain country that is more progressive than another. And if they're raised in that country, they will have progressive leanings. It's just part of their social formation. But that doesn't mean that their doctrine is progressive, necessarily, just their social formation, okay? And I say this many times, Pope Francis came from Argentina, which is a very socialistic country. So he's naturally going to be more progressive in his social formation, not in his doctrine, than, let's say, a Ratzinger, who was raised in Germany, a more conservative, at the time he was alive, more conservative, socially formed environment, okay? That's just their social formation. But some people confuse the two, and they'll attack the Pope because he has these social formative leanings. They don't distinguish discipline or from doctrine or social formation from doctrinal formation. And for this reason, Pope Benedict XVI, Emeritus, said that Pope Francis has a very profound theological formation. He's not talking about social formation, he's talking about theological formation. So Pope Francis has not said one thing doctrinally wrong, even though people are claiming this is false. I'm not speaking as a theologian who did my dissertation in Rome. I've examined all of his teachings. What he does is he says something from the hip, off the cuff, and the media takes it and spins it to their own agenda. And what happens? Those who are quick to criticize the Pope spread it as weapons against the Pope. And this hurts us because he is our vicar, the vicar of Christ and also our representative before God. And even Luisa Piccarreta, who held the papacy always in high esteem, respected him and considered him as such, the vicar of Christ. And we must pray for him. And he prays for us, obviously. So, first thing we must do in these days of confusion,